Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time joining us, thank you very much and I hope you enjoy the video. If you've learned something here, please consider subscribing so that you don't miss any of our new content. If you're coming back, thank you again for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about the basics of airbrushing. We're going to be talking about the equipment, the paints, some do's and don'ts, and some tips for success, as well as some exercises that will help you improve your skills. So we're going to start by showing you my equipment. So this is a airbrush compressor. What's nice about these airbrush compressors is that they are very quiet. Right now we are under the master bedroom in my home, and if my wife is sleeping and I'm spraying in early morning, she never knows that I'm down here. These airbrush compressors, like I mentioned, are very quiet. I'll turn this on so you can hear it. I don't know how well that's coming through on the camera. You can also use some large pancake style compressors or some large container compressors. Keep in mind that those are very loud, and that's something that you'll have to work around with that volume. The other thing I'll show you is a airbrush here. This is a siphon feed. There's actually a bottle that goes in the bottom here. The advantage of this is that it will hold a lot of paint with that large bottle. This is a double action, so as we push the trigger down, we're going to get air. As we pull back, we're going to get paint. This will give you a lot of control over your airbrushing as you move that trigger back and forth. You can also use a gravity feed brush. These, you'll put paint up top here. This works in very much the same way. You push the trigger down, you'll get air. As you pull the trigger back, you'll get paint. On my airbrush compressor, I prefer to use one of these quick connect assemblies here. I have many airbrushes, as you'll see, and hooking this up is very simple. We'll just push this down like we would any airbrush fitting. I like this little adapter because there's a little micro control valve right here. We can control the pressure at the airbrush. As far as paints go, you always want to use the appropriate kind of paint for your application. So if you're painting on plastic models, you can use something as these Tamiya paints here. You can also use Testors or Model Masters. Vallejo makes paints. Mission Models makes paints. There's a ton of paints out there for you to be able to use. Just make sure you choose the right one for your model. For basic craft paints, you can go to Hobby Lobby and pick up one of these. This also works very good for practice materials because if you waste this paint, it's not that expensive. When I'm doing skill building exercises, I'll use this. This will require a lot of thinning to get it through your airbrush properly, so just keep that in mind if you're using one of these craft paints. If you're painting on Lexan, you can also use these fast color paints from Parma. Parma has been around for a very long time. They're very well known in the hobby industry for Lexan paint. You can also use ProLines paints. These are pretty new to the industry. I've been using these for a very short period of time. I don't see a lot of difference between these and the fast color paints, but I can tell you that these don't require quite as much thinning, so that's a plus if you're beginning in the hobby. I also use paints from Createx. These I find work very well on Lexans, and if you're not near a traditional hobby store, you can pick these up at a Hobby Lobby. So these can be pretty convenient for you depending on where you live. So the next thing that I want to show you is what happens when your paint is improperly thinned or you're using the improper pressure. So I've got some unthinned craft paint in my airbrush here, so I can show you what happens. So we're going to All right, forgot to turn my compressor on. So we are going to start over here on the far side of the page, and we're going to start by pushing our trigger down. As we pull our trigger back, we'll start to get paint. Now when your paint is too thick, I don't know if you can hear it, the airbrush is almost machine gun-like in the way that it's throwing the paint out of it. Now I've just loaded a lot of paint onto this page here, and you'll see that that paint is not running off of our page. You'll also notice around the edge here, there's a lot of artifacts that are happening. It's spitting paint all over the page. So you're not going to get your cleanest of airbrush spray. The next one that I'll show you is what happens when your paint is too thin. So as soon as we pull the trigger back here and hit the page, you'll see that that paint kind of runs everywhere and it just makes a big mess. If we drop our pressure pretty low here, we'll use the MAC valve that's here. We'll drop our pressure really, really low, just to the point where it's spraying out that paint. And if we keep our airbrush moving, we can get a little bit of coverage area. You just have to be really, really careful when we're talking about spraying, because that will run. It also will not give you a lot of coverage, so it'll take quite a long time to get that properly painted. The last one that I'll show you is what happens when we have an airbrush that has paint that's properly thinned. So we'll get to our page here, and we'll pull our trigger back and slowly start to pull the trigger back. Might help if we open our valve up. Try again here. We'll push our trigger in. We'll slowly start to pull our trigger back. Keep our airbrush moving. And we'll just slowly start to build up the paint. This is an exercise in patience, because you do need to slowly build up the paint to get a completely covered subject. Now that we have a nice dot here, we can see what happens here. So we're going to have a nice solid color, but we're not going to have a lot of that artifacting around. You'll also notice there's a slight hue that kind of runs all around it. So that's some of the advantages of an airbrush when we're talking about painting. We can get these tighter spaces and nice clean paint. When we're airbrushing, we don't have to be a master painter to get very good results. So we can also use tape lines. So we'll put some basic blue painter's tape up here, and we can start down here on the tape. Now starting here, if we mess up with our paint, we're not destroying the model. Once we have our paint moving, we can work up to our tape line here and slowly build up our paint. If we work our way up, we can get a nice fading kind of shadow look. So now that that's done, we'll pull up our tape and I can show you what that looks like. Now the same thing goes for actually masking off. So if we wanted to mask between two spaces here in order to do something like a pinstripe, then we can just simply spray between the two tape lines. Now this doesn't require a lot of work here. You just kind of spray that in between and we'll end up with hard tape lines. So you can see what I've done there. Now for exercises that can improve your skill, we can do just dots. So if we do the same dots that we were doing before, just slowly pull the trigger back and then move over a space. And again, slowly pull the trigger back, keeping your airbrush moving. And basically repeat these dots. The idea is that you're trying to get even spacing here. Now when we fill the page, we can work down on the page. Same thing, keeping our even spacing. Just being patient. And then again, moving down. This will teach you target practicing so that you can get your paint exactly where you want it when you need it. Once you've filled your entire page full of those, you can do kind of a connect the dots kind of a thing. So starting over on the edge here, keeping your airbrush moving, slowly pulling your trigger back. This will teach you to hold your airbrush still as you're moving across your subject. Do the same thing this way. This is always an exercise in patience, and you want to develop that patience before you work on an actual model. Once they're done from left to right, I like to go from top to bottom. And you can see how beneficial this would be to teach you how to control your airbrush. Other exercises you can do are creating random shapes trying to get back to the original starting point. So we'll start with our dot as we were doing before, pulling our trigger back ever so slightly, and then very carefully working our way around and connect our dot. Now you can see what's happened here, and that is not the most clean line in the world, just because for demonstration purposes I was trying to hurry that along. The last technique that you can practice is something called a dagger stroke. Dagger strokes are something that I have always struggled with, and I've never taken the time to properly practice them. So we'll see if we can create that for you. The idea would be that you start far from the page, and you get your paint moving, and you move down into the page. You'll create this kind of dagger shape as you work. This is very beneficial when you're working on something like a drop shadow. And you can see from mine, I am not very good at this. I've always struggled to create these dagger strokes. The one I've struggled with the most are going in the reverse direction, because I always struggle to get a nice fine line from the beginning. So you can see how bad I struggle with these dagger strokes. So you can see with my practice material that I am not a master airbrusher. I have a lot to learn about airbrushes. I have a lot to learn about paint thinning. I just have a lot to learn, period. But with those basic skills, you can create some pretty easy and pretty incredible results. So what I have done here is I've taped a piece of Lexan-like material to my work surface here. And I want to show you the basics of how you would do a Lexan body. So I'm going to take a little bit more tape, and I'm just going to tape off right here in the middle of the body. Whenever you're doing tape, you always want to make sure that you're giving it a good mat down to make sure that you're going to have a good sealed line. Now off camera, I have cleaned out my airbrushes and I have added some new color paint here. So we're going to take this red and we're going to paint our Lexan surface. Now you want to make sure that when you're painting Lexan that you're doing very light coverages, because you're going to do more fill-in a moment. But you don't want to overdo it with your spray, because you'll get a run and that's harder to deal with. So I'm going to take my hair dryer here and I'm just going to blow dry this to a dry touch. So we'll take another coverage here and we're just going to do a little bit of a fill in. And another dry. And we're going to do one more coat for good measure. Now once we're dry to the touch, I'm touching here so that you can see that it's dry. You should always avoid touching your painted surfaces because you don't want to put oils on it from your skin. So we're going to peel up our tape here and we're going to do a pinstripe line between this red and our next color. Now in an ideal world, we would do black first. So you always do your darkest colors before you do your lighter colors, because you're going to find that black will pollute some colors, especially white. You'll end up with more of a gray color, or if you're doing a transparent red, that black will show through and you'll end up with a mostly dark color. But for the demonstration purposes, we're going to do it like this. So we'll take our black and we're just going to cover the entire surface here. You don't want to overdo it with your colors, so always remember your hair dryer. We're going to do one more coat for good measure. Then we'll peel up our paint here to reveal the rest of our unpainted surface. And I've loaded up some white in another airbrush, but before we do that, I want to show you how we utilize the shading technique that we played with earlier. So again, we'll make sure that our tape lines are pushed down nice and firm here. Then we're going to come down here to the bottom, and we're going to start spraying, but we're going to just spray about halfway over the tape here. And in this example, we're going to come up just a little bit, give us a nice dark line down at the bottom, but that soft finish. Now for measure, we're going to come over here to the corner so you can see this. If we just ease that black line, I went a little overboard, maybe we'll try over here. If we just ease that black line over here, we can get a really soft kind of shade right on the edge. Now we're going to load up our white. And for good measure, we're going to dry that black real quick. And we're going to spray our white. Now I want you to pay attention to what happens when we spray our white here, because the white is actually a little bit too thick for the airbrush. Did we turn off? Uh-oh. We have a clog. So this is actually good timing here because we have a little bit of a clog in our airbrush. I was going to go off camera and clean this out, but I figured this is a good learning exercise here. So we have a little bit of a clog and we weren't getting paint out of our airbrush. So when you have that, you can actually take your finger right here on the end of our airbrush and push our trigger down and slowly pull back. And what we're going to end up with is we'll end up with a little bit of backflush where it pushes the paint back up into the bottle. And then we'll clear out that clog. You can also remove your little cap right here. We don't want to remove the whole thing, we just want to remove the little end. We can remove our little cap right here, pull our trigger back and actually clean off the end of our airbrush because we'll get a little bit of tip dry here, which will cause some problems with a clog. So we'll spray our white. And you see again how messy that is coming out of the airbrush. It's just flinging paint everywhere. I don't know if you can hear the kind of machine gunning. Maybe I can get this a little closer to my mic. You can hear that kind of machine gunning there. But again, that's okay. It doesn't have to be pretty because it's the inside. We'll do a couple of coats of these. Yeah, we're having a good clog. There we go. Now we're getting some paint. Now you'll notice all of this around the outside edge here. If you've taped off your body, you can spray this in your tape areas. So if you're having this kind of clogging issue, that will do just fine to spray those out of your areas. You'll notice I'm painting right over top of the black here. I'm not covering this black, and you can if you want to, but we're not going to see any of this because that's going to be blocked by the paints that were painted before. So for demonstration purposes, we're going to leave it messy so that you can see it doesn't really matter once everything is all done. So we're going to pull this up here so you can see our finished result. And we'll get pretty close to the camera. So you can see that pinstripe line that we've done on the inside. You can see the top edge where we've done our little fade and my little screw up over here on the edge. So you see, even though it's a little screwed up, it doesn't look terrible because the way that we're doing our shading here. You can also look right at the edge here where we did that real fine misty kind of a thing. So again, you get a real good look at the fact that even though the paint isn't perfect, and even though there's some weird little stuff happening back here, there's some weird little screw ups, you're still gonna get a pretty neat finish when you're done. Now you'll notice that that red, so the red that actually came out of the airbrush is this. See how we darkened up our color? We darkened up our color because we backed this with a black. So that is the effect that you're gonna get when you don't paint your darkest colors first. So for a learning exercise, practicing on material like this is a great idea. But your practice material doesn't have to be flat like this. This is actually a container that little quiches come in, the little frozen quiches. This is the same type of material that you would see on a Lexan body, as is a soda bottle for that matter. So you can spray on a soda bottle, cut it in half. You can do this little practice material so that you're not wasting money on very expensive bodies. Well, I think we will end the video here. This has gone on quite a bit longer than I had anticipated. We'll pick it up in the next episode. I think in the next episode we may do airbrush cleaning, and the one after that we might get into some actual body painting. So stay tuned, and if you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Don't forget to comment down below if you have a request for future video. I'll see if I can get some of your questions and problems solved in videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.